blood is filtered and urine is formed. We need to know some functions of the urinary system. So first, it cleanses the blood of toxic substances, things like ammonia or urea or drugs. They're filtered out in the kidneys. It can also adjust the water and electrolyte content of blood, and that's important for controlling the blood volume, which has an effect on blood pressure. It can also adjust the pH of the blood, and again, we need our pH to be within a narrow range for life to happen. It also helps regulate blood pressure by determining how much blood flows to the kidneys. And it also has a role in red blood cell production. So when oxygen levels drop, the kidneys will make erythropoietin or EPO, which causes red blood cells to be produced. And we need to know the four organ systems that perform excretory processes. So respiratory is one. It gets rid of carbon dioxide. Integumentary is one. Through our sweat glands, we get rid of water and salts. Through the digestive, we get rid of feces, any undigested materials. And then the urinary gets rid of all the waste from our blood. So we need all of them working together to keep us healthy. Next, we're going to look at some parts of the kidneys. So they are against the posterior abdominal wall underneath the 12th rib. And if we look at the interior of the kidney, the outer region is called the renal cortex. And then the renal medulla is sort of the inner region. The medulla has a much higher osmolarity or concentration, and that allows us to concentrate the urine. The renal columns, you can see one here, they sort of separate out the renal pyramids, which are these triangle things. And the renal pyramids, that's where nephrons are going to be located and where urine formation is going to happen. The renal papilla is just the tip of the pyramid, and so as urine is produced, it's going to flow this way, and it's going to flow from the renal papilla into a minor calyx. So here's a minor calyx. So each pyramid drains into a minor calyx, and then the minor calyxes merge to form major calyxes. So these are just passageways for the urine, and then the major calyxes are going to merge to form the renal pelvis, which then drains into the ureter. The filtration units of the kidney are the nephron, and this is the structure of a nephron. We'll look at it more closely in a minute. First, we're going to look at the blood flow to the kidney. So blood enters the kidney through the renal artery, and then the renal artery is going to branch into smaller and smaller arteries until it becomes, now if we look at a close-up on a nephron, it's going to become the afferent arteriole of a nephron. And then after that, it's going to flow into this called the glomerulus, which has all these capillary loops. Then blood leaves the glomerulus through an efferent arteriole, which you see here. And then from the efferent arteriole, it leads to the peritubular capillaries, which surround these tubules. These peritubular capillaries pick up water and solutes reabsorbed by the renal tubules. And then the peritubular capillaries, they're going to lead to larger and larger veins that feed into the renal vein eventually. Alright, so a question, what are the filtration units of the kidney? And correct answer is the nephron. Next, we need to know the 3 steps in the process of urine formation. So the first step is glomerular filtration, which happens at the glomerulus. Next step is tubular reabsorption, and then the third step is tubular secretion. So we're going to talk about each of those. So if we look at the flow of filtrate. So once something leaves the blood, it's called filtrate, and it starts in what's called the renal corpuscle, here around the glomerulus. Then it's going to flow through the proximal convoluted tubule right here. Then it's going to go to the loop of Henle, and then it goes to the distal convoluted tubule out here, and then to the collecting duct. So that's the flow of filtrate through the nephron. Next, we're going to talk about glomerular filtration. So the blood enters through this afferent arteriole, and you can see the afferent arteriole is much bigger than the efferent arteriole. Since the afferent arteriole has a much bigger diameter, there's going to be more resistance in the efferent arteriole, and that makes the pressure in the glomerulus very high. So these are just capillaries, and since they're such high pressure, it causes the water and everything dissolved in it to leave through filtration, and then it's going to flow through the tubules, and basically we reabsorb the good things and we secrete bad things. Next, we need to know how hypertension damages the kidney. So hypertension is high blood pressure. So it increases the already high glomerular pressure and can cause glomerular capillaries to burst. If that happens, you would see blood in the urine, and that's not good. Hypertension also causes atherosclerosis, which can decrease blood flow to the kidneys, and if they don't get enough blood flow, they can't do their job. Alright, next we're going to talk about tubular reabsorption and secretion, so we're going to watch this animation.
The creation of urine by the nephrons involves three processes: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. The first step in the creation of urine from blood plasma occurs in the glomerulus. Blood flows into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole. Because the afferent arteriole is larger than the efferent arteriole, blood flows in faster than it can leave. This contributes to higher pressure within the glomerular capillaries. The pressure causes water and small solutes, such as electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, and nitrogenous wastes, to filter through small pores in the walls of the glomerular capillaries into Bowman's capsule. Blood cells and most plasma proteins are too large to pass through the pores. The fluid that filters into Bowman's capsule then flows into the renal tubules. There, sodium moves by active transport out of the proximal convoluted tubule and into the bloodstream of the peritubular capillaries. Water follows sodium, diffusing rapidly from the tubular fluid into the blood. Glucose, amino acids, chloride, potassium, and bicarbonate also pass out of the tubules and into the blood. About half of the nitrogenous waste, urea, is also reabsorbed. Simultaneously, wastes such as ammonia and uric acid, as well as drugs such as aspirin and penicillin, are secreted out of the blood and into the tubules. Tubular secretion of hydrogen ions also occurs, helping to regulate the body's pH. Next, water diffuses out of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, further concentrating the filtrate. In the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, sodium and chloride are actively pumped into interstitial fluid. The thicker wall of the ascending limb prevents water from following sodium out of the tubule. The distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts reabsorb variable amounts of water and salts. Specialized cells within this part of the nephron play a role in acid-base balance, reabsorbing potassium and secreting hydrogen into the tubule. Finally, the collecting duct reabsorbs water and concentrates the urine.
Alright, so that does a good job explaining the whole process of urine formation. So in the proximal convoluted tubule, which is right here, sodium moves out of the filtrate, and again water follows it, and glucose, potassium, bicarbonate, urea, they're all reabsorbed, and the wastes move in, so ammonia, uric acid, drugs are all moving into the tubules, into the filtrate. the descending limb of the loop of Henle, water diffuses out, and that concentrates the filtrate. In the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, sodium is pumped out, and water can't follow. So that makes it less concentrated again. In the distal convoluted tubule, water and salts can be reabsorbed. Hydrogen ions can be secreted here if needed, if we need to adjust the pH. And then in the collecting duct, water is reabsorbed. And so, depending on how much you're drinking and what hormones are present, you can reabsorb 99% of the water um, that is filtered out. So, that is urine formation. Next, we're going to talk about some hormones. Or next, we're going to have a question. Most sodium is reabsorbed from the glomerular filtrate in the. And correct answer is the proximal convoluted tubule. That's where most things are reabsorbed. Now we're going to talk about some hormones. So aldosterone, its effect on the kidneys, it causes them to reabsorb sodium and chloride, and then water follows that. And the effect on the blood volume there, that is going to increase the blood volume, and that is going to increase the blood pressure as well. Then atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, it's released by the heart. It causes the kidneys to excrete sodium chloride and water. So that is going to lower the blood volume, and that is going to lower the blood pressure. And then we have parathyroid hormone, PTH. It causes the kidneys to reabsorb calcium. This doesn't really have an effect on blood volume or on blood pressure, but it's important for the calcium regulation. Alright, so the urine, it's produced in the kidneys. It travels through the ureters. Ureters take urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. The urinary bladder is a storage reservoir for the urine because we're not always in a place where it's convenient to urinate. So luckily we can store it, and then we can go on long car trips and things like that. The urethra is the passageway from the bladder to the outside. And so for urination to happen, there are stretch receptors in the bladder, and they send impulses to the spinal cord telling you your bladder is full. The spinal cord then will send motor impulses to the bladder to empty it. The pons can override these impulses, and the brain sends signals to contract or relax the sphincter. So let's watch this animation on the micturition reflex.
Urination, which is also called micturition, begins when the external sphincter muscle of the bladder voluntarily relaxes and the detrusor muscle of the bladder contracts. The entire process involves several steps requiring input from the central nervous system. Specifically, when the bladder contains 200 milliliters or more of urine, stretch receptors in the bladder wall send impulses to the sacral region of the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends motor impulses to the bladder wall to contract and to the internal sphincter to relax. When this happens, voiding will occur involuntarily unless the brain overrides the impulse. The brain can override the impulse to void because stretch receptors in the bladder also send impulses to the micturition center in the pons. The pons integrates information from the stretch receptors with information from other parts of the brain, such as the cerebrum, and evaluates whether the time is appropriate to urinate. If the time to urinate is not appropriate, the brain sends impulses to keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which inhibits urination. If the time to urinate is appropriate, the brain sends signals to the bladder wall to contract and to the external urethral sphincter to relax. At that point, voluntary urination will occur.
Alright, so if we look at the muscles in the bladder, most of them are smooth muscles, so they're involuntary. There's two sphincters. There's an internal urethral sphincter, which is smooth muscle, and the external urethral sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. So this is the one we can control. And when your children learn to control that, it is a wonderful day. You don't have to buy diapers anymore. All right, couple more things we need to know the cause of kidney stones. So, kidney stones, or their technical name is renal calculi, result when minerals such as calcium, phosphate, uric acid, or protein crystallize in the renal pelvis. This probably happens and they're small enough we don't even notice them. They just go out through the urine. But when these stones become large enough to block the renal pelvis or the ureter, um, when that occurs, it hurts a lot. The ureter contracts trying to get them out. If it stays lodged in, it can cause urine to back up, and that causes what's called hydronephrosis, meaning water in your kidneys. Most kidney stones aren't that bad, but some are big enough that as they travel through the ureter, it causes a ton of pain. Very painful. Um, we can try to treat it with basically sound waves that break it up, or they can just give you medicine that basically makes you urinate more, or tries to flush it out. So that's kidney stones. Then we need to know what renal insufficiency is, or renal failure. That's when an extensive number of nephrons have been destroyed through disease or injury, impairing the ability of the kidneys to function. So the kidneys can no longer filter your blood. Toxins will build up in your blood, and that's not good. So you need either dialysis or a kidney transplant. Uh, and we need to know the two types of dialysis. Hemodialysis is the more common one, where blood is pumped from the patient's radial artery in your arm into a dialysis machine. In the machine, the blood flows through a series of semi-permeable tubes immersed in dialysis fluid. So the waste products like urea, potassium, creatinine, and extra water, they're going to diffuse out of the blood into the dialysis fluid. Then that dialysis fluid is discarded. In peritoneal dialysis, the peritoneum, so inside your kind of the outside of your abdominal cavity, it serves as the semi-permeable membrane. So in this procedure, dialysis fluid is introduced into the peritoneal cavity through a catheter. The fluid is then left in the body for a few minutes to an hour, depending on the person's needs. The waste products diffuse out of the blood and into the dialysate, which is the dialysis fluid. And then at the end of the specified time, the fluid is drained, and hopefully all the wastes go with it, and then it's discarded.